Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today I'm talking about the new album from Alon, Long-Awaited Journey. I don't know if it's Alon Moore or Alon Moore, I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm going with Alon Moore because it sounds less like the appliance used to cut grass. Alright, Alon Moore is an artist that I'd previously never heard of from Israel. I honestly probably wouldn't have covered this ordinarily, since I have no idea who he is, seemed to be the obscure Bandcamp variety, but I did get a couple of requests to cover this from people who thought I would really like this thing. And I'll admit, I was intrigued by some of the reviews I'd been hearing. Apparently, this was supposed to be some kind of cinematic concept album or something like that. And then, of course, I got a little poke from my friend Landon Remixes, who told me, "Hey, man, you should check out this Lawnmower guy out. He's really good." So I decided, why not? I'll cover him. Now, this is the guy's sophomore album, so I first checked out his debut album, Masters of the Human Imagination. And, wow. There is so freaking much to unpack in this thing, I'm kind of at a loss for words. Maybe I'll make a full video on it another time, but this album blended so freaking many elements from dubstep and IDM and chiptune with a ton of orchestral elements. This was an album that impressed me from the same level as an album like Coma Duster's Hollow Worlds did. It's the kind of album that clearly came out of someone with insane talents and crazy attention to detail, someone who obsessively put tons and tons of work into it. There was a little weird sort of disconnect with me, though. Like, the sound designs and ideas in this thing were absolutely mind-blowing, but I felt emotionally distant from it. I mean, obviously it lived up to gigantic grand epicness that reminded me of how this guy's name makes him sound like a Star Wars character. I'm sorry if that sounded racist, but that's... But for whatever reason, it felt more like the kind of thing I'd need to be in the right mood to get into. To be fair, I remember Hollow Worlds kind of having a similar impact on me when I first got into that 2 years ago, and it grew on me more later, so whatever. I mean, obviously I only listened to the debut twice, so yeah. I can tell this guy poured so freaking much blood, sweat, and tears into it, so believe me when I say, regardless of my own weirdly detached first reaction to it, there is an absolute crap ton to enjoy there. So I guess going into the second album, Long-Awaited Journey, I was hoping for a progression similar to that of Coma Duster's Solace from earlier. Yeah, I know a lot of Coma Duster comparisons, but they are similar. Long-Awaited Journey turned out not to be really that far a cry from the first album in the end, or that much of a progression, aside from the addition of a loose story, but I did obviously give myself a lot more time to process this one and let it grow on me. I figured maybe my lack of emotional connection to the first album would have just had to do with my mood at the time, and yes, I do believe that is a very big part of it. I've been listening to this thing on and off for several weeks now, and my reaction has varied quite a bit. This album was on my year-end list, obviously. In fact, it was going to make the list proper, but I felt like I didn't have enough time before 2017 was over to get my thoughts in order. Like, there was one listen where it really clicked right before the end of the year, but unfortunately it wasn't my last listen in 2017. Next time I heard it again, I once again just had my misgivings about it. I've been just kinda all over the place on it, though once again I figured this wasn't going to get anything lower than a solid 8 at any point. There are so many things I have to say about Long-Awaited Journey, both praises and minor nitpicks. And I would say there's more of the former than the latter. First of all, I wouldn't say this album is like an exact clone of his debut. Aside from the story elements, which obviously set this album apart, I think the production in general is a major step up. Like, Masters of the Human Imagination was no less impressive purely from an arrangement standpoint, but I could tell that everything was MIDI. I mean, it's not like an underground artist with no previous work to his name was going to be able to pull off a real live orchestra. It was obviously all synth presets made to imitate orchestras. This could also be true of Long-Awaited Journey, for all I know, but if it is, he did a way better job at hiding it. The sonic textures here sound a lot more organic and real this time around. Every detail seems to have been magnified by 10 or something. Like, for example, his first album had a track called Graphic Rain, where he'd take all these synthesized sounds to basically sound like water splashing, and it sounded like you could hear, like, every individual drop in there. And this album utilizes this effect as well, A lot, I might add. But it sounds like triple or quadruple the amount of sounds and layers went into that effect alone. Seriously, if this dude doesn't get a job as a film composer or sound designer in Hollywood or elsewhere, I will be shocked. His attention to detail is unlike anything I've ever heard. So, where to even begin with this thing on an individual track basis? I feel like if I were to just go down track by track, I'd be stuck here too long, since nearly every track has so much substance. And discussing which tracks I like and don't like kinda directly tie into my thoughts on the album as a complete whole. See, Long-Awaited Journey, for the most part, is an album that I feel is stronger as a complete unbroken whole than it does from an individual track-by-track basis. This is an album that definitely tries to set up a pretty consistent mood basically the whole time. There are a lot of tracks that I have a lot of similar things to say about. Tracks that echo each other or reprise themes and ideas. It's just that there are more than a few tracks in which I just don't really have a lot to say about. Before I start talking about individual tracks, I'm first gonna have to discuss the story this album is going for because it just ties into everything. Now, the story is admittedly pretty vague. It's not your traditional boy meets girl story or anything like that, even though there does appear to be a boy and a girl here. No, this story is very clearly not meant to be taken literally. From what I can piece together, it follows one guy's entire lifetime, from his birth in El Despertar, The Awakening, to his death in Halpfire Harmonies, and his search for what his life means throughout his life. And this album does not give you a clear answer at all. Not just from the fact that this album is primarily instrumental. I mean, you got tracks like Taishi's Singing, or however you say that, which seem to be there purely for furthering the story of the album, talking about him flipping a coin and reaching a bridge. There's a lot of talk about a bridge on this album that has some sort of symbolic meaning. I mean, actually, you got a bridge on this album cover right here. It may not look like a bridge from far away, but if you zoom in really close to this one section in the middle, you can see like a little car and some kind of restaurant. So this big red strip here that's on the album must be the bridge that he's talking about. I mean, the way he talks about it and the way it's portrayed on this cover, I think it's supposed to, like, symbolize him finding a higher purpose in life. And he also talks about the Middelar in a few tracks, even names one track after it. And I have no idea what the Middelar is. He talks about it being a place where there's no despair. I guess that's the best meaning I could come up with it. Because, like, it's not an English word. When I googled it, it just brought me back to this exact song. And when I Google translated it from Spanish, since there are more than a few Spanish song titles here, I got measure. I mean, also that translation did not go both ways. But I guess maybe it's a reference to a musical measure? I mean, like, it's supposed to be about how he's happiest when he's making his music? I mean, maybe I'm reading too deep into it and it's just a word he made up, but this is kind of an album designed to be read too deep into, and this is about the full extent of what I can piece together out of the story. Like I said, it is vague. I mean, you got tracks that show him getting older, from meeting the love of his life in Holly's necklace, then talking about how she stared at him years ago, so he's later in life during Taishi's Singing. He's placing late night Skyline before early morning winds. That was a weird choice to me initially, but made me think about how people often like staying up later when they're younger and then get up earlier as they get older. And then he just straight up tells people to go on without him on the final track while seemingly on his deathbed or something. Yeah, obviously the story is clearly supposed to be open to interpretation, but I actually don't mind its vagueness all that much. I mean, it kind of comes off to me as some kind of end of Evangelion style mindfuck. You come out having no idea what the hell you even listen to, but the answers are technically all there if you want to make something out of it. You know, it's trying to really exercise that literary analysis part of people's brains that I so rarely exercise in my work on this channel. Now, what I don't like about the story, though, is not obviously the story itself. I think that's alright, but I don't really like the way he presents it. For the most part, he basically just does this spoken word narration thing, and I could not really get into this element of the album much at all. It took me at least 10 listens to even remotely get over this guy's voice. I mean, this is clearly something he can't control, but for me personally, it was something that just kept breaking my immersion. Like, this guy's voice is deeper than Morgan Freeman, and he's got a bit of an accent, and he completely caught me off guard anytime I heard him. Let's do something crazy tonight. When the unusual becomes usual, that's when things start to get interesting. I really want to be able to take him seriously, but it's tough. Especially when, like, he does this old man voice in the last 2 tracks. The roads that lead us to where we are. And he is literal crying on the 3rd track, Recuerdos. I mean, I guess more pieces of the giant puzzle he set forth for people, but not stuff I actually personally enjoyed listening to. Especially when it comes to a track like Taichi Singing, where his voice played such a prominent role and was furthering the story the whole time. I mean, again, I appreciate its purpose in the context of the album, but I wouldn't totally mind skipping it sometimes. Because, I mean, the main thing I personally got enjoyment out of this whole thing wasn't analyzing the story. I mean, I had fun with that for this video. I'm not used to doing that kind of thing on this channel. But that's not the main thing I enjoyed out of this. I just enjoyed listening to this for the amazing sound design and cinematic mood he creates. It's difficult to describe what Alon Moore's music sounds like. Comparing him to BT or Coma Duster feels like it's getting somewhere in the right ballpark, but it's not really doing it justice. More than anything, this guy just reminds me of film soundtracks. It's kind of got a lot of more modern EDM influences in some of the synth tone choices, but a lot of it is more IDM-ish in that it doesn't really have any defined structure and he just kind of does whatever he wants. There's some elements of jazz and occasional little Spanish flares thrown in there from time to time. And, of course, there is plenty of orchestral tones here. Like I said earlier, I don't know if he got a real live orchestra for this album, but it really does sound like it. And it's really awesome anytime it shows up. Like, the closest thing you have to a straightforward EDM sort of track is maybe Holly's Necklace, complete with epic build-up and satisfying payoffs. Though even that sort of turns into a synthwave sort of track halfway through, complete with vocoders at the end. Kinda wish he would use more vocoders. There's the more noisy but like flashy IDM stuff like Mania and Late Night Skyline. There's the more down-tempo centric Early Morning Winds and Encore. There's orchestras all over this thing, and Alon Moore just doesn't care where you would expect sounds to go. It goes where he thinks it should go and nowhere else. Like I said, comes off very film soundtracky, especially in the way he keeps reprising certain themes and bringing back sounds you've heard already, like a lot of soundtracks often do. And of course, there are so many beautiful orchestral moments on, like, every track. One moment that sticks out to me in particular as awesome was the cellos at the beginning of Halpfire Harmonies. That track, I think, is the most impressive use of the orchestral tones, but yeah. But like I said, that's kind of why the spoken word stuff is a problem for me, because it always just seems to bring whatever momentum the music had going to a dead stop, and it takes me out of it. He treats his narration basically as film dialogue. Most of the time when he's talking, not a lot else is happening so that you can focus on what he's saying. And yeah, I appreciate it being there for the sake of the story, as I said many times, but it takes away from my personal listening experience. I feel like there's a part of me who would just like to hear this album without the story elements involved and just get the music. Well, that's kind of what his first album was, but yeah, you get the idea. Another thing I gotta talk about with this album that kind of bugged me, like, you know how I was talking about that Graphic Rain track from his first album and how he utilized a much more impressive version of this, like, cracking ice effect he created throughout this album? Well, he utilizes this effect a lot. A lot. Like 2 entire tracks that seem to be primarily focused on it, and the 2 longest ones too, Recuerdos and the Middler. Yeah, it is a shame. These are tracks that I want to like more given how they are the 2 longest on the album. They're clearly supposed to be huge centerpieces for the album, but I often wasn't looking forward to these as much. Now obviously I like the effect and it's impressive and it's cool that he spent so much time on it, but I'd be lying if I said it came off particularly musical. Like, it often feels more like it's trying to transition us into a new idea, and I wish not as much time was spent on it. Especially on Recuerdos. Like, he keeps throwing in little musical snippets during these stretches of cracking ice effects that sounded really cool, but they would never get, like, more than 20 seconds to develop. Often you would only hear like half a second and then it'd just go away. I kept thinking, you have all these cool ideas, why won't you just let these ideas get some space to develop? Like the Middler had at one point had this cool Spanish influence theme come in for a moment, and it sounded like it was going to stay there, But again, like 20 seconds later, it was all gone. We were back to ice cracking. And I was like, okay, I think I get it. Can we, like, stick to something, please? Yeah, it was something that I personally found to be mildly irritating, but I will also have to point out that is one hell of a unique problem for me to have with an album. Those cracking ice tracks may not have been personal highlights exactly, but I still haven't heard anything remotely like it before. I'll still give him points for the idea, and he was nice enough to include an example of what these longer tracks might have been like if he'd given the ideas more time to breathe in Los Recuerdos. That was a really good one. It is kind of interesting how these 3 longest tracks are kind of similar, but they get progressively better and more musical as they're placed further on in the album. But, whatever. So yeah, I've done a lot of rambling. I think it's about time I close this review up. In the end, yeah, there are obviously lots of personal nitpicks with this album that made it not as rewarding a listening experience as I would personally like. It took a long time to fully grow on me. And in the end, I do wish it were maybe a bit more accessible. I mean, this album is nearly completely devoid of hooks. It's not the kind of thing I'm going to get stuck in my head unless I've been listening to it on repeat for like an entire day, which I kind of have. Closest thing we get to a track with actual hooks would be Early Morning Winds, the piano thing, and maybe Holly's Necklace or Mania, but they're not precisely the most catchy stuff themselves. I'm sure some people will be like, well, not everything has to have hooks and pop appeal to be good. And yeah, that's true, but I'll point you over to an album that's fairly similar, but I get more personal enjoyment out of. BT's This Binary Universe. That album's also really abstract, floats all over the place, and doesn't stick to any traditionally defined structures like this album does, but it still manages to craft hooks that can get stuck in my head, and really great melodies that keep drawing me in. Now, it's not like Long Way to Journey has no melody, far from it. But this album to me is more like a full film soundtrack. And I don't mean like an album of musical score cues for a movie, no. I mean like all the audio for some crazy experimental film complete with prominent sound effects and dialogue. I mean, I'll admit, I don't know of any album like this. But yeah, it's an album that will challenge you. It's an album that does not spoon-feed you or care about being easy to wrap your head around. It is very difficult for me to wrap my head around, but it goes as far into its concept as it can possibly go. I just personally would have liked something with a bit more immediacy. It took me so many repeat listens for me to even remotely pin down how I even feel. Either way, I would definitely go out of my way to support this man. He has talent unlike anything I've ever seen before. This album is unlike anything I've ever heard before, and while not necessarily one of the most personally enjoyable albums I've ever heard, it is one of the most impressive and ambitious I've ever heard, and one that, while I can't believe it even exists or fathom that one guy may have been able to pull this off all by himself, even despite all that, I did still get a lot of personal enjoyment from it. This is an album that, even though I don't see myself pulling it out with a ton of frequency, it is still an album I'm going to be listening to for years and still pick up on new things I didn't notice before. Definite recommendation for this. I have all the best wishes for this dude's future, so I think overall I'm feeling an 8.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.